It's the big wheel sound of power.
Oh, Jenna's gonna go. Okay, go, Jenna.
See you guys!
Do you remember the scrappy, hand-me-down fun that made childhood magic when money was tight? In the 1970s, these simple, no-cost pastimes filled long afternoons and stitched neighborhoods together in ways money never could. Looking back now, was being broke the best thing that ever happened to us? Playing kick the can in the street was more than just a game. It was a nightly event that pulled the whole neighborhood together. You would drag an empty can to the middle of the street, usually dented from 1,000 kicks before, and the rules were simple. One person guarded the can while the others hid, and anyone who made it back to give the can a solid kick freed everyone else. It was hide and seek mixed with a race, and it always felt more exciting when the streetlights came on and shadows stretched long. There was no fancy equipment, just a dented can and kids with endless energy. Cars passing through would force the game to pause for a second before starting back up exactly where it left off. The sound of that can rattling across the asphalt was like a signal for more kids to join in. You learned to run fast, hide better, and never give up until the game was done. In its own way, it was training for life, working together, strategizing, and celebrating small victories. It cost nothing, but somehow felt richer than any store-bought toy. It was the kind of fun you could only have when the street belonged to the kids, and every echoing clang of the can meant the night was still young. Climbing trees and building makeshift treehouses was the kind of adventure that needed no adult supervision, though it probably should have had some. You picked the tallest, sturdiest tree in the yard or the empty lot down the street, and from there it became your headquarters. Old boards, bent nails, and rope borrowed from someone's garage turned into a platform high above the ground. You were not just playing. You were building something that was yours. Sometimes the treehouse was nothing more than a shaky floor and a couple of walls, but it was a castle to you. Friends brought treasures to store inside, comic books, snacks, or a flashlight for late-night meetings. The higher you climbed, the more you felt like you owned the whole neighborhood. Falling out was always a risk, but that was part of the thrill. These treehouses were private worlds where you could be loud, plan wild adventures, or just sit quietly looking out over your street. And when you climbed down at sunset, hands covered in sap and pockets full of ideas, you knew you would be back tomorrow. Making a slip and slide from a plastic tarp was as close as you could get to having your own water park. All you needed was a long sheet of plastic, a hose, and maybe a little dish soap to make it extra slick. You would spread the tarp down a small hill if you were lucky enough to have one, then take turns running and diving onto it. The cold shock of water hitting your skin in the summer heat was addictive. Kids took pride in the longest, fastest slide, even if it ended in grass burns. Sometimes you would set up little obstacles like pool noodles or buckets to jump over before hitting the slide. On the hottest days, even the grown-ups would sneak in a turn, pretending it was just to test it out for safety. Sometimes the tarp had holes patched with duct tape, but that never stopped the fun. You would end up soaked, muddy, and grinning from ear to ear. Even the occasional belly flop was worth it for the chance to keep sliding all afternoon. It was messy, sure, but that was half the fun. And when the sun started to set, the tarp would get rolled up and tucked away, waiting for the next day's heat wave. Riding big wheels. Until the wheels wore flat was a rite of passage for every kid who had one. Those bright plastic tricycles with oversized front wheels were built for speed, at least the kind of speed you could get by pedaling furiously down the sidewalk. You leaned into turns like a race car driver and skidded to dramatic stops just to hear the wheels squeal. After a while, the plastic would grind down to the point where the front wheel had flat spots, making every ride go bump, bump, bump. It did not matter. You kept riding until the whole thing rattled like it was falling apart. Some kids would ride so much that the front wheel became completely see-through in spots from being worn down. Every scrape on the frame felt like a trophy from a race you had won or a crash you had survived. Big wheels were low to the ground, which made every turn feel daring and every downhill run a mini thrill ride. You could race friends in the driveway or see who could spin out the longest without tipping over. Even when the stickers faded and the pedals wobbled, you loved it like it was brand new. By the time you finally outgrew it, The big wheel had been through years of crashes, races, and neighborhood adventures, and it wore every scuff like a badge of honor. Rolling down hills in cardboard boxes turned a plain grassy slope into an amusement park ride. You would flatten a big box, sit inside, and push off with your hands until gravity took over. The world blurred around you as you bumped and slid toward the bottom. Sometimes the box ripped halfway down and you would tumble out laughing. Grass stains and dirt-smudged faces were proof you had done it right. If the hill was steep enough, it felt like you were flying. When two boxes went down side by side, it instantly turned into a race, with cheering from the top of the hill. By the end of the day, the grass was worn into tracks from so many rides, like a homemade roller coaster path. Friends would take turns timing runs to see who was the fastest. Every empty appliance box in the neighborhood suddenly became valuable. It was pure, chaotic fun that cost nothing but left you with stories to tell. And no matter how many times you rolled down, you always climbed back up for just one more ride. Using old bed sheets as superhero capes turned every kid into someone extraordinary. You would tie one around your neck, let it billow behind you, and suddenly the backyard was a city in need of saving. Your jumps off porch steps became heroic leaps, and every stick in the yard was a magic sword or laser blaster. Some capes were patterned with flowers or stripes, but in your mind, they were pure superhero gear. The cape could turn you into anything. One day, a masked crusader, the next, a swashbuckling pirate, or even the leader of an imaginary army. Friends argued over who got to be the main hero, but everyone still got their moment to shine. Sometimes the mission meant climbing the tallest tree or rescuing a stuffed animal from certain doom. Other times it was just running as fast as you could to see the cape fly straight behind you. It was a costume, a uniform, and a ticket to another world all in one. Siblings and friends would create entire teams, complete with made-up powers and elaborate origin stories. Sometimes the cape dragged in the dirt, but that just meant you had been on more daring missions. A breeze on a sunny day made you feel like you were truly airborne. Parents might have scolded you for getting grass stains, but it was worth it. The magic of those bedsheet capes was that they worked every time. You did not need a store costume when you had imagination. Catching lightning bugs in jars was the closest thing to holding magic in your hands. On warm summer nights, the yard would sparkle with tiny flashes, and you would dart around trying to catch them. A quick, gentle scoop with your hands, and you had one glowing in your palm. You would poke holes in the jar lid so they could breathe, adding grass to make it feel like home. Sometimes you chased one for what felt like forever, only for it to disappear right in front of you. When you finally caught a handful, the jar lit up like a tiny lantern you could carry around. Friends might line up their jars side by side to see whose glowed the brightest. If you tipped the jar gently, you could watch the little bugs crawl slowly up the glass before taking flight. Letting them go at the end of the night felt like sending your magic back into the sky. The soft yellow light was mesmerizing, like a living lantern. Friends would compare how many they caught, turning it into a friendly competition. The real joy came when you let them go, watching the lights scatter back into the dark. It felt like sharing a secret with the night. It was simple, gentle fun that slowed time down for a while, making summer feel endless. Raiding scrap piles to build go-karts was part scavenger hunt, part engineering challenge. You would scour alleys, garages, and junk piles for anything with wheels, old stroller parts, busted lawnmower frames, wooden planks. With enough creativity, you could bolt or nail them together into something that, hopefully, rolled. The first ride was always a gamble. You never knew if it would steer straight or fall apart. You learned how to make do with bent nails, mismatched wheels, and whatever tools you could borrow. The steering was often shaky, so half the fun was keeping it from veering into a fence. If the brakes did not work, you just planned your runs to end in grass or dirt. Painting the frame with leftover house paint made it look like a real racer. Every fix and upgrade felt like turning scrap into gold. Friends would take turns pushing and riding, cheering each other on down the street. Painted flames or numbers made them feel like real race cars. Sometimes you crashed into a curb, but That just meant it was time to fix and improve the design. By the end of summer, your go-kart was a rolling scrapbook of every adventure you had with it. It was dangerous, sure, but also some of the most rewarding fun you could have with nothing but scraps and determination. Making scooters from milk crates and roller skate wheels was a do-it-yourself project that ended up being pure joy. You would find a sturdy board, attach some skate wheels to the bottom, and nail a milk crate to the front for steering. The crate doubled as a basket for carrying treasures, or your little brother if he fit. The ride was bumpy and loud, but you felt unstoppable. If you hit a crack in the sidewalk, you felt every jolt in your knees. But that just made the ride more thrilling. Some kids padded the crate with rags or old shirts so it was more comfortable to hold on to. A fresh set of skate wheels made you feel like you had just doubled your speed. When you leaned hard into a turn, it felt like you were in a race car. The louder it rattled, the more it felt like you were riding something truly powerful. You could zip down sidewalks, leaning hard to make sharp turns. If a wheel came loose, it was an excuse to raid the toolbox and make it stronger. Friends would race each other, the clatter of wheels echoing through the block. It may have looked like a pile of junk on wheels, but to you it was freedom. Every scrape and squeak was part of its charm, and every ride felt like an adventure. Jumping rope with clothesline was the budget-friendly answer to store-bought jump ropes. Someone would cut a length of old clothesline, tie knots at the ends for grips, and you were ready to go. You could jump solo or have two people swing the rope while others lined up to take turns. The slap of the rope on the pavement set the rhythm. In double Dutch mode, the rope moved so fast it was just a blur, and getting in without tripping was a triumph. Chants and rhymes kept everyone laughing and in sync. Kids competed to see who could jump the longest without missing a beat. Sometimes the rope stung when it caught your legs, but you shook it off and kept playing. Even when the knots came loose, you tied them back and started again. Chants and rhymes made the game even better, and everyone knew the words by heart. You learned fancy moves, crossing your arms, hopping on one foot, or speeding up to double time. If the rope frayed, you just cut a new piece and kept playing. It was a game you could play anywhere, from driveways to schoolyards. It cost nothing, but it built skill, coordination, and endless laughter. And when the sun went down, the rope got coiled up, ready for another day. Creating mini races with matchbox cars and dirt tracks was the perfect mix of imagination and competition. You would carve winding lanes into the dirt with sticks or your hands, sometimes building jumps or bank turns. The goal was always to make the track as tricky as possible without your car flipping over. You would smooth the lanes with your palms to help the wheels roll faster. Some tracks even had pit stops, just a spot in the dirt where you pretended to fix your car before racing again. Kids argued over the best lane, swearing one side was faster than the other. If someone's car got stuck, others would rush in to push it out, turning competitors into teammates for a moment. A sudden gust of wind or a poorly aimed kick of dirt could change the whole outcome of a race. By the last round, the cars were caked in dust like they had just finished a desert rally. Sometimes you poured water into a section to make a mud pit, daring your car to survive it. Friends would bring their fastest or rarest cars, bragging about how they had the best wheels for the job. If a car flipped, everyone groaned, but it only made the next race more exciting. By the end of the day, the track was worn in like a real racing circuit. Dirt under your nails and a pocket full of matchbox cars meant you had spent the afternoon doing something that felt epic, even if it was all happening in a patch of backyard dirt. Sledding on garbage can. Lids in the winter was resourcefulness in action. Real sleds were great, but if you did not have one, you grabbed the metal lid from the garbage can and went to the nearest hill. You would sit on it, tuck your feet, and push off, spinning and bumping your way down. The metal was cold and noisy, but it was fast, sometimes faster than an actual sled. You learned quickly that a smooth, icy path made you fly, while fresh snow slowed you down. Some kids would polish the underside with wax or even cooking spray for extra speed. The ride was bumpy, sending you bouncing so much your teeth chattered. If you tipped over, you rolled down laughing, clutching the lid like a trophy. When a group of you went down together, the hill turned into a chaos of spinning metal and shouting voices. If the lid was dented, it might wobble, making the ride unpredictable and hilarious. Sometimes 2 kids would pile on, holding tight as they spun to the bottom. You always had to bring it back before your parents noticed it was missing from the can. The dents and scratches became badges of honor, proof of a winter well spent. You never needed perfect equipment, just something slippery and the courage to aim it downhill. Flying homemade kites from newspapers and sticks was part science project, part pure joy. You would cross 2 sticks, tape or glue them together, and wrap them with string. Then you covered the frame with newspaper, sometimes decorating it with crayons before it ever touched the sky. A long tail made of tied-together scraps of cloth helped keep it steady. The first successful liftoff felt like a personal victory over nature. If the wind died, you ran with the string just to keep it aloft for a few seconds. Sometimes the string tangled in a tree, forcing a rescue mission with more sticks and teamwork. When a kite tore, patching it became a badge of experience, not a setback. Every kid swore their design was the fastest or could fly the highest, even if it barely stayed in the air. If the wind caught just right, it soared like something store-bought. When it crashed, you patched it with more tape and sent it back up. It was the kind of activity where the making was just as fun as the flying. Every successful flight felt like you had outsmarted the wind itself. Standing in an open field, gripping the string as tight as you could, you felt connected to something bigger, even if it was just a patchwork kite fluttering in the breeze. Drawing hopscotch boards with sidewalk chalk or rocks was a way to turn a bare slab of pavement into a playground. You would sketch out the boxes, number them, and toss a small rock or bottle cap to mark your spot. The hop, hop, jump rhythm was almost like music. You learned balance without even realizing it. When someone messed up, the teasing was all in good fun, most of the time. On windy days, you had to redraw the chalk lines because the dust faded them too quickly. Kids invented new patterns with extra boxes or shapes, making the game harder. A really good throw landed exactly on the line, forcing the next player into a tricky balance. Barefoot in summer or bundled up in sneakers in spring, the game worked in any season. Sometimes the lines were crooked, but everyone knew what they meant. If chalk was not available, you scratched the board into the dirt with a stick. On hot days, the chalk dust stuck to your fingers, proof you had been playing for hours. The sound of shoes hitting pavement in steady rhythm was as satisfying as winning the game. It was competitive but friendly, a game that made waiting turns just as fun as playing because you could cheer or tease your friends in between jumps. Playing marbles on the sidewalk was as much about skill as it was about collecting. You would draw a circle with chalk or in the dirt, line up the marbles, and then take turns trying to knock them out with a sharp flick of your shooter. Your best marble was always the one you kept in your pocket, worn smooth from constant use. Some kids played for keeps, making the stakes a little more serious. Sometimes the circle was drawn so small it made the game nearly impossible and more exciting. A lucky hit that knocked out multiple marbles at once was cause for celebration. If you lost your favorite shooter, it felt like losing a piece of treasure. Onlookers often offered advice that was really just a distraction. The sun glinting off the glass made the marbles look like jewels scattered on the ground. The sound of marbles clicking together was instantly recognizable. You learned aim, patience, and just how much pressure to use without overshooting. By the end of the day, your knees were dusty from crouching, and your pockets were heavier, or lighter, depending on your luck. Winning meant bragging rights, but playing was always its own reward. Sliding on waxed cardboard across hardwood floors was indoor fun at its finest. You would tear a piece of cardboard from a box, rub it with candle wax or soap, and place it under your feet like makeshift skates. Then you would run, jump on, and glide across the floor. You could race siblings or friends to see who could slide the farthest without losing balance. Sometimes you tried spins or jumps mid-slide, which usually ended with a dramatic crash into the couch. The cardboard would get soft and frayed over time, but that only meant it had been well used. Parents might shout about the noise or the risk to the furniture, but deep down they knew it kept you busy on rainy days. It was a mix of skill and recklessness, and that made it unforgettable. Socks made it even faster. though they also made falling more likely. You had to dodge furniture and sometimes siblings who refused to move out of the way. A perfect slide meant reaching the far wall without wiping out. It was just dangerous enough to feel thrilling without getting you grounded. The scuff marks were worth the speed. On rainy days, it was the closest thing to having your own skating rink, just made out of scraps and imagination. Skipping stones at the pond or creek was about finding that perfect flat rock. You would stand at the edge of the water, take aim, and flick your wrist to send it skipping. Each skip felt like a tiny victory. You might spend more time searching for the right stone than actually throwing it. Sometimes the water was calm enough that the stone seemed to float across it forever. On windy days, the ripples made it harder, turning each skip into a real challenge. Kids bragged about their record number of skips, even if no one else saw it happen. A bad throw that sank instantly brought laughter just as loud as a great one. The best stones were smooth and thin, and finding one was half the fun. Sometimes you counted skips, other times you just watched it sail. Friends competed to see whose stone could go the farthest. Every splash at the end meant another chance to try again. It was quiet fun, with the only sounds being laughter and the plop of stones hitting water. The calm of the water and the simple rhythm of throwing made it feel like time slowed down. Rolling hoops or old bicycle tires with sticks was an art form all its own. You would grab a stick, place it inside the rim, and run alongside to keep it rolling upright. The trick was to keep it going without letting it wobble and fall. The faster you ran, the harder it was to keep control, making it more exciting. Friends sometimes raced side by side, their hoops clattering over bumps and cracks. A perfectly straight run felt like you had mastered something ancient and important. If the tire veered into the grass, it slowed just enough to let you catch your breath before the next push. Some kids practiced steering around obstacles like flower beds or mailboxes just to show off. Some kids decorated their hoops with colored tape or paint. If you got good at it, you could steer around corners or over bumps. The sound of a tire humming along the pavement became a kind of music. It was a race against gravity and your own legs. When it finally tipped over, you just set it up and started again. It was cheap, endless fun that kept you running until you were out of breath but still smiling. Using plastic soda bottles as bowling pins turned any stretch of flat ground into a bowling alley. You would line them up in a triangle and roll whatever ball you had handy. If you wanted a challenge, you filled the bottles with a little water to make them harder to knock down. The bottles were often mismatched, with different labels and sizes adding to the charm. Sometimes the lane was a driveway, other times it was just a hallway in the house. Kids experimented with different balls to see which knocked down the most pins. When the pins scattered, there was a scramble to set them back up before the next turn. A strike brought cheers like you were in a real bowling alley. The clatter of pins toppling was as satisfying as any real bowling lane. Sometimes you played for score, other times just to see if you could get them all in one shot. You learned how to roll straight without the help of gutters or bumpers. Even when a ball missed completely, it was funny enough to keep going. By the end, everyone was chasing runaway bottles down the street. It was a sport you could set up in minutes, and it made even the smallest yard feel like a game zone. Making mud pies and serving them to friends was messy, hilarious fun. You would scoop dirt into an old pan or lid, add water, and stir until it reached the perfect batter consistency. Then you would pat it into shape, decorate with leaves or pebbles, and present it like it was gourmet cooking. If you were really creative, you set up an entire restaurant with menus made from scrap paper. Friends might order specials that required extra flowers or shiny stones. The best days were after heavy rain when the mud was soft enough to mold easily. Parents would groan at the mess, but secretly enjoy seeing you so focused and happy. Arguments sometimes broke out over who was the head chef, but they never lasted long. Friends pretended to be fancy guests, judging the flavor with exaggerated reactions. You could build an entire bakery with rows of mud creations. The best pies were made after a good rain, when the mud was soft and easy to work with. Sometimes you threw in wildflowers for decoration, even if they wilted fast. It was never about eating, it was about making something together, laughing until you were covered in mud yourself. By the end, everyone went home dirty but happy, proof that the best games never needed anything but a little imagination and a lot of mess. Putting on talent shows in the backyard was an event that could take weeks of planning or be thrown together in the same afternoon. The stage might have been nothing more than a couple of old sheets clipped to a clothesline or a patch of grass marked off with lawn chairs. You and your friends would decide who was singing, who was dancing, and who was going to pull off the comedy act that was really just telling jokes you half remembered from TV. Someone always had to be the announcer, introducing each act like it was happening at a packed theater. The costumes came from whatever you could find: scarves, old hats, and your mom's high heels that were 3 sizes too big. Props were improvised, like a broom for a microphone or a tennis racket for a guitar. You would rehearse all afternoon, stopping to argue about the lineup before finally inviting the neighbors to watch. Parents sat on folding chairs, sipping iced tea, clapping for every act, no matter how off-key or awkward. Even the failures became legendary, like when someone forgot their lines or tripped over the dog mid-performance. By the end, you were sweaty, hoarse, and already talking about the next show you were going to do. It was part performance, part excuse to get everyone together, and part proof that you could turn an ordinary backyard into a stage big enough for your imagination. Making jewelry from pop tops and string was a craft project born entirely from what you could scavenge. You would collect aluminum pop tops from soda or beer cans, careful to pick the ones that still had the full ring, and string them together using whatever you had on hand. Sometimes it was yarn, sometimes fishing line, and sometimes just old shoelaces. Necklaces and bracelets were the most common, but belts and headbands made you feel like a fashion designer. The pop tops clinked together when you moved, giving your creation a kind of charm you could not buy in a store. If you got really fancy, you painted them or wrapped them in colored thread. Wearing something you had made yourself felt like a small victory in a world where new clothes were rare. Friends would trade pieces, comparing designs like they were priceless jewels. It was recycling before anyone called it that, and it proved you could make something cool out of things other people threw away. Every time you caught the light glinting off your pop-top bracelet, it felt like you were wearing a piece of your own creativity. Digging holes. Just to see how deep you could go was the ultimate unplanned afternoon adventure. Armed with a garden spade or even just your hands, you picked a spot and started digging. At first, it was about finding worms or rocks, but soon it turned into a challenge. How far could you really go? The dirt smell would get stronger the deeper you dug, and cool earth felt different from the dry topsoil. Sometimes you pretended you were digging to China or tunneling your way to treasure. If you hit a root or a big rock, it felt like a discovery worth calling the others over to see. Buckets were used to haul away the dirt, and before you knew it, you had made a hole big enough to climb into. There was always the danger of a parent telling you to fill it back in before someone broke an ankle. By the end, you were filthy from head to toe, your fingernails caked with mud, but there was pride in looking at what you had made. It was physical, messy fun that cost nothing and left you feeling like you had conquered a small piece of the earth. Playing mumble-te-peg with pocket knives was the kind of pastime that made adults nervous, which was probably part of why kids loved it. All you needed was a pocket knife and a patch of dirt or grass. The goal was to toss the knife so it stuck into the ground in a series of increasingly tricky moves. You would start simple, then try flips, spins, and throws from behind your back. Each successful stick meant you got to move to the next challenge, and missing meant it was the other person's turn. The knife made a satisfying thud when it landed just right. There was always a mix of skill, bravado, and luck involved. Sometimes the game ended early when someone's knife hit a rock and the tip bent, but that just meant more stories to tell later. It was dangerous, yes, but it carried the same thrill as climbing too high in a tree or racing downhill without brakes. The risk made it feel more real, and the victories felt bigger because you had earned them with steady hands and a little bit of daring. Riding down the street on a skateboard made from a 2x4 and skate wheels was pure 1970s ingenuity. Store-bought skateboards were a luxury, so you made your own with whatever scraps you could find. A sturdy plank, A pair of metal roller skate trucks and a handful of bolts were all it took. The ride was rough, every crack in the pavement rattling up through your feet. Turning was more about leaning your whole body than subtle steering. You could not do tricks like on modern boards, but you could race friends or bomb down a hill faster than you probably should. Sometimes the wheel seized up, sending you flying into the grass or, if you were unlucky, onto the pavement. Every scrape and bruise was proof you had been out there pushing the limits of your homemade ride. You learned balance the hard way by trial and error, and every improvement, tightening the bolts, sanding the board, made it feel more like your own. It was loud, clunky, and completely imperfect, but it was also freedom on four wheels, built by your own two hands. They were not just vehicles, they were dreams on wheels, decked out in shag carpet and questionable murals of wizards and wolves. Vansploitation films took the freedom and rebellion of the open road and turned it into cinematic chaos. The plot usually did not matter. A guy, a girl, a van, and a summer full of terrible decisions, that was enough. The Van in 1977 set the tone, a teenage fantasy of cruising, partying, and trying to look cool while living in your car. And people loved it. Because those vans were more than transportation. They were rolling bedrooms, bars, escape pods. They had curtains. They had couches. Some had lava lamps. If you were lucky, yours had an 8-track player and speakers in the back. The funny part is how deeply uncool it looks now. But at the time, it was everything. Independence, adventure, privacy. For a generation raised on rules, the van was a loophole with fuzzy dice on the mirror. Hip-hop was born in the Bronx, but in the 80s, it exploded into every corner of American life. It was not just a sound, it was a movement. And when Run DMC hit the stage in Adidas tracksuits and shell-toe sneakers, you knew the world was about to change. This was more than music. It was poetry over beats, rhythm over silence, truth over noise. The 80s marked hip-hop's rise from underground parties to global power. LL Cool J, Public Enemy, Grandmaster Flash. These were not just rappers. They were messengers. Each lyric felt like a coded message from the streets, a heartbeat from the city itself. Hip-hop spoke about struggle, pride, injustice, and survival in a way that made you stop, listen, and feel. And the style? Just as fierce. Gold chains, Kangol hats, boomboxes on shoulders. This was fashion with purpose. The look was bold, but the voice behind it was louder. Breakdancing hit sidewalks like fire. Graffiti tagged the city with identity. And everywhere you turned, the bass dropped like a gavel. Hip-hop turned sneakers into icons and turned raw truth into chart toppers. It did not ask for a seat at the table. It built its own table, right there on the pavement. And anyone who came of age in the 80s knew they were witnessing the rise of a new American language, one that still speaks volumes. There was a time when flour was not just something you kept in a bag in the pantry. In the mid-20th century, many kitchens came with a built-in flour bin right in the counter, an aluminum drawer that pulled out like a bread box and held pounds of flour at once. At the bottom of that bin, a small metal crank-operated sifter attached directly to the front panel. You turned the handle and watched flour fall like powdery snow into a bowl. Housewives loved it because it was fast, tidy, and always right where you needed it. There was a rhythm to it. The soft grind of metal, the whisper of sifted flour, the calm before the dough. It was not just about baking, it was about the ritual that came before it. But as kitchens got sleeker and flour got sold in resealable paper bags with built-in spouts, this feature disappeared. New cabinets were built without them, and most people never even noticed. Today, the few remaining ones are either sealed shut or filled with junk no one wants to deal with. You can find one in an old home and still smell the ghost of biscuits and pie crusts. But no one teaches you how to use the crank anymore. Like so many kitchen traditions, it quietly faded into the background, and now it lives only in memory, or maybe in Grandma's house if you are lucky. When did our tools become so disposable? Soul Train was not just a television show, it was a movement in motion, and every Saturday morning it danced straight through your living room. It did not matter where you lived or what you had. If you turned on the television and saw that bright kaleidoscopic set and heard the beat drop, you were part of something electric. It brought soul, funk, disco, and joy into millions of homes, giving Black culture the spotlight it long deserved. The fashion was wild and beautiful. The dancers were bold and free. It was not choreographed. It was felt. Soul Train lines were legendary because they turned the spotlight on the everyday person. It was joy on tape, beamed straight into a nation that often forgot how good it felt to dance. Even the silence after an episode ended felt louder somehow. Anyone with the courage to move could step forward. It gave kids in small towns the chance to see a world bigger, louder, and more alive than anything they had known. For many, it was the first time they saw themselves reflected on screen, not just as background, but as the show. Now, it is tucked away in archives, replaced by algorithm-fed clips and sterile edits. But once, it was pure. Once, it was fire. And once, it told a generation, you matter, and your rhythm belongs. What happens when the music that moved a generation fades into silence? Beanbag chairs were anti-furniture. They didn't care about structure, design, or lumbar support. They just wanted you to plop down, sink in, and forget your bones existed. They came in colors that didn't match anything: burnt orange, pea green, electric blue, and textures that felt like cheap dreams. Vinyl usually, sometimes velvet, always squeaky. You didn't sit on a beanbag. You disappeared into it. For kids, they were a throne. For teens, a nest. For adults, a regrettable purchase they kept anyway. They made you feel like you were living in a space-age lounge or the back room of a groovy record store. They weren't just chairs. They were rebellion in blob form. Beanbags made rooms feel like clubs or crash pads. No corners, no edges, just wobbling, sagging piles of synthetic comfort. They were everywhere: basements, dorms, bedrooms, game rooms. And the moment you fell into one, you stopped caring about anything else. That was the trick. The funny part? They were impossible to get out of gracefully. You didn't stand, you rolled, you crawled, you clawed at the air like you were escaping quicksand. But that was part of the charm. Beanbag chairs didn't try to be elegant, they were honest. Honest about what the 1970s really needed: a place to collapse, decompress, and just vibe out. It started with 6 colors, just 6. But somehow, it unlocked a puzzle that would challenge millions of minds and define an era. The Rubik's Cube was not just a toy. It was an obsession, a flex, a frustration, and a badge of honor, all crammed into a twisting, clicking square. You either solved it or you peeled the stickers off. There was no in-between. Classrooms, kitchens, and family living rooms were all temporary battlegrounds for who could line up the colors first. It looked simple, but it demanded patience, logic, and a kind of determination that made it feel like a test of character. And oh, the speed solvers, like magicians, like gods. The cube became a status symbol among kids and a stress toy for adults. It was everywhere: commercials, competitions, cereal box giveaways. You were not cool if you had not at least tried to conquer it. For a moment, the Rubik's Cube was the brainy heart of the decade, a symbol of what it meant to be smart and stylish. It taught an entire generation to keep twisting, keep trying, and keep believing that order could come from chaos. Behind the smooth cabinet doors of many mid-century kitchens hid a surprising tool: a pull-out dish drainer that lived inside the wall. After washing dishes, you would slide out the rack, load it up, and let everything drip dry behind closed doors. It kept counters clear, made the kitchen look tidy, and gave a sense of order that matched the rest of the house. Some even had small trays underneath to catch the water. It was not about hiding the mess. It was about making space feel peaceful. When plastic racks and countertop drainers became standard, these hidden drying systems quietly disappeared. New kitchens no longer had room for them, and they were hard to clean and prone to mold. But there was something thoughtful about them, something neat, something kind of charming. Now, we just pile dishes in the sink or leave them out for hours. The idea of drying dishes out of sight feels like something from a different era. One where appearances mattered, but so did small comforts. What else have we stopped tucking away for the sake of convenience? The 8-track tape was a clunky plastic miracle. It did not rewind. It did not fast-forward well. It clicked in the middle of a song. And yet, we loved it. There was nothing quite like that satisfying chunk as the cartridge slid into place. You were not just playing music, you were launching something. The 8-track was freedom. You could take it in your car. You could swap them with friends. You could build a music collection that was finally portable. For kids in the 1970s, it was the sound of independence. You did not scroll, you committed. Each cartridge felt like a mixtape cast in stone. Sure, the quality was not great. The tapes jammed, the cases cracked, but holding one felt like holding the future. And in some ways it was. The 8-track taught us to curate, to choose, to chase the next sound. It vanished quickly, made obsolete by cassettes. But if you ever hear that mechanical click mid-song, your heart still remembers. Why do the formats we tossed aside leave the sharpest echoes? TV dinners were more than food. They were a revolution in a foil tray. You'd pull one from the freezer, peel back the corner, and slide it into the oven with a hope and a prayer. 25 minutes later, you had dinner. Kind of. The mashed potatoes were crusty on one side and icy on the other. The gravy had merged with the corn. And that chocolate brownie in the corner? A molten rock capable of scorching the roof of your mouth until Tuesday. But none of that mattered, because you got to eat on a metal tray in the living room while watching All in the Family. You didn't need to set the table. You didn't need to talk. TV dinners gave families a strange kind of freedom, the freedom to be alone together. The funny part is how futuristic they felt, even though they were never that good. But they were consistent, they were easy. And in a time when everyone was juggling work, inflation, and nuclear anxiety, convenience was king. We laugh now. But we kept buying them, because they gave us time. And that, back then, was worth more than taste. No one was ready. Not the music industry, not the public, not even the moon, which he would soon walk across. In 1982, Michael Jackson released Thriller, a title that would come to define the very heartbeat of pop culture. This was not just an album, it was a tidal wave. Every track felt like it could carry its own legacy, but it was the music video, the short film really, that sent shockwaves through every living room in America. Red leather jackets, ghoulish dance moves, Vincent Price's eerie monologue echoing into a generation's dreams. It was scary. It was sexy. It was genius. Thriller redefined what a pop star could be. Michael was no longer just a singer. He was a world builder, a visual storyteller, a phenomenon. He shattered racial barriers on MTV, igniting a cultural shift that went beyond music. Parents, kids, teens, grandmothers, everyone danced, everyone watched. Thriller became a global obsession, and suddenly Halloween had a new anthem: the glove, the lean, the laugh. It was not just entertainment, it was an event. To be alive in the 80s was to live in the shadow of Thriller. And to this day, nothing has ever moved quite like it. Before Bluetooth speakers and smart home assistants, there was the built-in wall radio. Usually installed near the phone nook or tucked into a panel above the kitchen counter, this was your portal to the world. With one turn of a giant knob, you could get the weather, farm reports, school closings, or your favorite midday jazz station. Some had small intercom buttons for calling upstairs or out to the garage. It was kitchen multitasking before anyone used the word. Moms would hum along while stirring soup or call the kids for dinner through the built-in speaker. You knew what time it was by the voice on the radio, not your phone. It was the soundtrack of daily life, soft static, local news, and old familiar jingles. Even the quiet moments felt fuller with it playing in the background. But as media moved to TV, then to handheld devices, these built-ins became obsolete. Wires were cut, faces painted over. Now, if you find one in an old house, it looks like a forgotten control panel from a spaceship. Once, it brought life into the kitchen. Now, it is just a silent square on the wall. We carry entire sound systems in our pockets today, but they do not echo down the hallway the same way. What did we lose when the kitchen stopped singing? It is hard to explain the thrill of the first time Pong appeared on a living room television. It was just a white dot bouncing between two white paddles. But to a child in 1975, it felt like magic. There was no need for coins, no dim arcade smell, no crowd leaning over your shoulder. For the first time, you could play a real video game in your own house. That alone was revolutionary. You turned a dial, the paddle moved, and you forgot the outside world existed. It brought the arcade inside, and it was the very first glimpse of a future we now take for granted. The Atari Home Pong console was sleek and simple, a beige and black box that looked like it came from a spaceship. It was not just entertainment, it was a portal. With every bounce, you felt like you were living in the future. But more than its looks, it was the feeling. Families gathered around after dinner. Parents played with their kids. It was something you did together. That white blip bouncing back and forth was more than a game. It was a moment, a memory, and the start of everything. Today, Pong feels quaint, even silly. But in the 1970s, it was a revolution in a plastic shell. How did something so quiet and pixelated spark a worldwide obsession? Clackers were dangerous, but that just made them better. Two acrylic spheres tethered by string, daring you to swing them so perfectly they'd smack together in a perfect rhythm. When you got it right, magic. When you didn't, bruises. Every playground in the 1970s echoed with the unmistakable clack, clack, clack of kids testing their reflexes and pushing their luck. You'd time your swings, adjust your grip, and pray your fingers didn't get caught. There were no rules, no instructions, just noise and adrenaline. They were toys with consequences, which somehow made them cooler. Every mark left behind was worn like a badge of honor. Clackers were banned in some schools, feared by parents, but that only added to their mystique. You weren't just playing, you were proving something. You could handle it. You had skills, or at least, you were brave enough to try. The funny part? We kept buying them, breaking them, and begging for more. Clackers weren't safe, but they were unforgettable. Madonna was not just a pop star, she was a cultural earthquake in stilettos. With every music video, every outfit, every defiant stare into the camera, she redefined what it meant to be a woman on stage. Like a Virgin was not just a song. It was a dare, a challenge to tradition, a celebration of contradiction. She was innocence and provocation, lace gloves and rosaries, punk attitude and disco flair. No one looked like her. No one acted like her. And that was the point. In a world trying to box in femininity, Madonna kicked the walls down in heels. She made fashion dangerous again. Layered bracelets, teased hair, oversized crucifixes. Suddenly, teen girls everywhere were dressing like her, talking like her, being her. Her fashion was not an accessory to her music. It was the message: be bold, be loud, be unapologetically you. She did not just influence trends, she created blueprints. And behind the sequins and fishnets was something deeper. The idea that pop could be powerful, that glam could be gritty, and that no one had to ask permission to be seen. Madonna turned rebellion into runway. She gave attitude a soundtrack. And for anyone growing up in the 80s, she was proof that being different could make you unforgettable. There was a time when scooping flour or sugar straight from a bag was considered messy, even unsanitary. So someone had a brilliant idea. Deep wooden drawers fitted with smooth metal bins and little mounted scoopers. You would slide it open, scoop out just the amount you needed, and close it back up. No spills, no waste. It was clean, it was fast, and it made you feel like a proper baker. These drawers usually lived near the stove or prep station, and they made baking feel like a craft, like painting, but with cinnamon rolls. Every scoop felt intentional, like part of a recipe passed down through hands and time. You measured with care, not just precision. But with the rise of pre-measured mixes and bagged ingredients, the scoop drawer lost its place. Newer kitchens skipped the installation, and old ones were remodeled with plain cabinets. The bins got dusty. The scoops went missing. Now, most people would not even recognize the little hooks inside, let alone know what they were for. But they once made cooking feel personal and precise. You measured by feel, by weight, not by printed numbers on the back of a pouch. What have we traded away in the name of convenience? Sequins and leather, smudged eyeliner and busted amps. Glam Punk was the glorious, greasy collision of everything too beautiful and too angry to fit in. It took the sparkle of glam rock and smashed it into the snarling mouth of punk, and what came out was electric. The New York Dolls looked like they fell out of a glitter bomb during a street fight. They strutted and screamed, smeared with makeup, wearing heels and ripped fishnets, flipping the bird at every rule in music and fashion. This was not about perfection, it was about presence, about noise, about guts. Glam Punk walked like it owned the stage and did not care if it fell off. It was funny, too, how seriously it made fun of itself. There was always a wink behind the mascara, a joke in every riff. But underneath the chaos was something real, something raw, a message wrapped in tinsel and distortion. Be loud, be weird, be ugly and beautiful at the same time. In a world trying to package you into neat little boxes, Glam Punk kicked the boxes over and danced on top of them in platform boots. Before Nintendo, video games were gasping for breath. After Nintendo, they were alive again. It was 1985 when the Nintendo Entertainment System hit American shelves and changed living rooms forever. The gray and red console was a Trojan horse, simple in design but hiding worlds inside. Suddenly, you were not just a kid. You were Mario, leaping through pipes to save the princess. You were Link, braving dungeons for the Triforce. You were part of something massive. Nintendo did not just bring games. It brought heroes. It brought soundtracks you could hum in your sleep and cheat codes whispered like secret spells. The controller became an extension of your hand. Blowing into cartridges felt like a ritual, and beating a level felt like beating life itself. For many, Nintendo was not a toy. It was a friend, a daily escape, a safe place to fail and try again. Families gathered around the screen, arguing over whose turn it was. Siblings became rivals, parents got curious, and the living room was never the same again. With every beep and pixel, Nintendo gave us wonder, and it never asked for anything more than time and imagination. It is hard to explain to someone today why there would be an ironing board in the kitchen, but for generations of American homemakers, ironing while cooking made perfect sense. You could press shirts while pasta boiled. The ironing board lived behind a narrow cabinet door, usually next to the fridge or near a pantry wall. You would open the latch, fold it down, and start ironing right there on the linoleum. It made the kitchen feel like a command center. Meals, laundry, homework, all happening at once. Some were even wired with built-in sockets, so you could plug in your iron without running cords across the room. There was something deeply efficient and strangely comforting about handling both dinner and dress shirts in the same breath. It made the kitchen feel like the heart of everything, not just the place where food was made. It sounds absurd now, but back then it was the ultimate multitasker's dream. Eventually, fashion changed, and so did fabrics. Permanent press clothing came along, and ironing became less of a daily ritual. Builders stopped including these wall units, and the ones that remained often jammed or collected dust. Today, a recessed ironing board in the kitchen wall feels like something out of a time capsule. You can still see the outline on painted-over cabinet doors in old houses, but no one's waiting on the kettle while smoothing out their slacks anymore. What else have we quietly stopped doing? Polyester leisure suits were loud, shiny, and unapologetically bold. They were not just clothing, they were a state of mind. Wearing one meant you were not afraid to stand out, to sweat a little, to dance a lot. These suits shimmered under disco lights, turned heads at the roller rink, and clung to your every move. They were not comfortable, they were not breathable, but they were unforgettable. The cut was wide, the collars were wider, and the colors ranged from banana cream to burnt orange. Every department store carried them. Every television dad had one. Every uncle wore one to a wedding. They were like armor for extroverts, Flashy, fearless, and fun. You were not blending in. You were making an entrance before you even opened your mouth. They were the uniform of a generation trying to find cool in chaos. And for a brief window, they were it. Today, they are costume shop punchlines, but they once made people feel slick, sharp, and modern. They were part rebellion, part performance, part polyester fantasy. Why did we ever let go of a style that dared us to be this loud on purpose? It sounded like mariachi horns over a guitar solo. It felt like a backyard cookout mixed with a garage concert. Chicano rock was not just music, it was resistance, pride, a celebration. Born from Mexican-American communities and stitched together with rhythm, blues, Latin beats, and American rock, this genre gave voice to generations caught between cultures. It was the soundtrack of identity, of straddling two worlds and singing from both. Bands like El Chicano and Tierra turned that tightrope walk into an anthem, melodies that carried history in every chord, and they played with heart, soul, grit. You could hear the roots in every note and still dance to it with a plate of rice and beans in your hand. The funny part is how invisible it was to the mainstream for so long, how something so vibrant, so loud could be so overlooked. But if you were part of the community, it was everywhere. At parties, on radios, echoing from lowriders cruising the boulevard. Chicano rock did not just blend genres, it blended generations. It told stories no one else was telling. And it proved that music, like identity, could be layered, complicated, and absolutely electrifying. There was a time when music lived only in sound. Then came 1981, and with it, a glowing screen that changed everything. Music television, better known as MTV. Suddenly, music had a face, a costume, a storyline, and a look that mattered just as much as the lyrics. It was not just about hearing your favorite artist, it was about watching them come alive in color. Madonna spun in lace gloves, Prince shimmered in purple silk, and Michael Jackson moonwalked straight into American living rooms like a ghost dancing across the carpet. For a generation growing up in the 80s, MTV was not just television. It was a mood. It was an identity. It was your coolest friend who introduced you to new bands at midnight. And the power it had? Unmatched. If MTV played your song, you were somebody. If they did not, you might as well be invisible. The channel became the tastemaker, gatekeeper, and trendsetter. Teens obsessed over VJs like they were movie stars. Style, language, and attitude spilled from the screen into everyday life. MTV turned bedrooms into dance floors and band posters into sacred wall shrines. This was the birth of visual culture as we know it, and it all started with a rocket ship and a music video. The electric hot plate built into the countertop was not meant to replace the stove. It was there for the in-between moments, the simmering, the reheating, the lonely cup of soup on a gray afternoon. It looked like a single stovetop coil embedded right into the counter, usually near the sink or beside the coffee station. You turned the knob and it glowed red. No pots stacked on burners, no full stove required. For single servings or quick boils, it was perfect. They became especially popular in the 1950s and 1960s during the height of the modern kitchen boom. They were sleek, functional, and felt futuristic. But they came with risks. Open coils got hot fast, stayed hot longer, and were sometimes forgotten. Over time, homeowners chose to have more counter space instead. The coils vanished, replaced with cutting boards and clean surfaces. But those hot plates once stood for independence, the idea that a small meal still mattered, that a house could be big, but one burner could still feel like home. What part of the kitchen did we lose when we made everything smooth? The chatter telephone by Fisher-Price was more than a toy. It was a rite of passage. Long before smartphones and screen time, toddlers dragged this smiling, wide-eyed friend behind them like a badge of growing up. It clacked as it rolled, its rotary dial spinning with every giggle and grab. Children pretended to make calls, mimicking parents with absolute seriousness, pressing plastic receivers to their ears and speaking into the world. It was not electronic. It made no real calls, but it was powerful. Because it gave kids something adults had: control, conversation, importance. It was not just play, it was practice. With every pretend conversation, a child rehearsed how to be heard. Every child who played with it was rehearsing a future where they would matter. The clicking eyes, the ringing bell, the chunky plastic body, it was built to survive anything. And most did. Decades later, many are still found in attics, dusted with time but still smiling. For a generation, the chatter telephone was the first introduction to technology, play, and imagination, long before those things were ever separate. Why does one of our earliest toys still feel more human than the phones we carry today? If these scrappy 1970s pastimes brought back memories or gave you a smile, share your favorite in the comments, tap like to keep the nostalgia rolling, and subscribe so you never miss another trip down the back roads of childhood.